education and knowledge is power.
But mainly he'll include a link to our website and Facebook page, which has articles and links about all of these.
Yeah. And also on this issue about Cyprus and a potential implosion here, if anyone thinks that Cyprus, the raid on bank deposits couldn't happen here, I'm sorry, the Bank of England and the American FDIC have already looked at it. They published a paper in December looking at, what do you want to call it, a levy, a tax, a bail-in, whatever you want to call it. They've already looked at it. And Mervyn, as David Malone said when he was here, Mervyn King said, and this was in February 2008, it is hard not to conclude that the British banks are insolvent. So we've thrown the entire nation's economy at propping these people up, and for what? They're insolvent. So we've got to do something about this issue.
So see that you have to talk about negative interest rates.
Who knows where it's going to go? John and then Mandy, please.
Fascinating story, I really enjoyed it. And what for me you described as a culture which is pretty much rotten to the core.
Cool.
Regulation's only going to change an element of that culture. What do you think, I mean, looking at using Cyprus as an example, do you think that it will reduce the apathy amongst the masses when people start having money taken out of the bank account? Do you think that will drive a faster cultural change? I mean, do you think something will change differently in Cyprus because of the raid on the bank account?
Well, I don't know whether many of you are familiar with somebody once, there was a group of academics meeting at a sort of Cambridge conference, and somebody said, they invited the question and said, do you think that history has really learned the lessons of the French Revolution? And another academic said, oh my dear chap, it's far too early to tell you. And I think that's the answer. The only answer I can give you to the Cyprus side of things. I don't know. I'm already stepping in areas where I'm having to educate myself. I mean, if you want me to talk about nicking bad guys in the city, I can do that all night. But what I tell you what I do fear, and we were talking about it this afternoon. I'll tell you what I really fear. We had last Monday, the Monday just gone, we saw the introduction of significant changes in the way in which benefits and the way in which people are being supported has changed. Now, I don't want to make a big argument. I don't want to get involved in an argument about whether benefit culture and all that stuff. For myself, I do believe that there are elements of the benefit structure that do need reform. And I doubt many people here tonight wouldn't in some way say, well, yeah, there is some reform that is necessary. But one thing I have got terrible, terrible personal experience of is that I think that if there is any more demand, if we start pushing for much more case making for bailing out bankers and for taxpayers to have to start standing up these worthless institutions and these rotten, disgraceful criminals. So I'm speaking like I think now. I fear that it will lead to the most dreadful social unrest. And my true fear is, as a policeman, I went through the 70s. I was at just about every major riot in London in the late 70s. I mean, as a uniformed bobby, I was there. And I can tell you, I was saying to Phil this afternoon, I have never, when it kicks off, I'm not talking about a gang of kids going for the free shopping, in Manchester and London and kicking in the windows of Nike shoes and nicking televisions. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when whole sectors of your community turn. Those kids, the reason the cops got it wrong was because the last rioting, the reason they got it wrong was they failed to understand. Cops are trained to deal with static situations where people are standing there lobbing stuff at each other. Whereas those kids went on a hit and run thing. It was just running through and moving on. The cops couldn't handle it. Got it horribly wrong, sadly. very embarrassing. But I was involved in the 70s when it was in the static situation where you saw people literally taking on the community. I've never been so frightened in all my life. I genuinely thought one particular day, I thought I was going to die, where we were looking at a whole phalanx of members of the National Front coming towards us with pickaxe handles and God knows what else. And no, I can't make a camera. But and I don't know if any of you have had this terrible experience, but I mean, when you actually experience civil unrest where people have nothing to lose, it is truly awful. And that is what I fear is going to happen in our inner cities. And I don't think it's very far away. That people will say, no, I'm not going to do this. And I think they'll start targeting banks. And I think they'll start targeting financial institutions. And I think it will be sheer, just outright rage. I think the last time we saw it, I had left the job by then, but I think the last time we saw it was in Thatcher's poll tax riots. Remember the poll tax riots? And they're pretty grubby. And I think the next lot that kick off are going to be just the same. And that's what I fear, genuinely.
I think the kudos of banking, you know, if you meet someone when you're out and about, they're almost embarrassed to say they're a banker now, whereas 10, 15 years ago we were quite proud to
You're right.
say that.
You're very right.
Okay, so we said Mandy, this young lady, Sean, and then anybody else, was it? Oh, I'm sorry, this gentleman and then yourself. I'm sorry, thank you for waiting.
Just a brief point about house prices, because the gentleman is fantastic. It was all based on house prices ultimately. And in fact, that's not the case at all. The case is that house prices are part of the same house of cards as everything else is. But one of the benefits of house price inflation for the financial classes is that people pretty near the bottom of the order think that they've got loads of money, so they will draw on that, so they will actually are much more ready to take part in overspending and therefore creating all of the ability of financial classes to cream off this continual passing, which is what they've been doing.
That is an important point, actually. You know, this whole sort of we've been living beyond our means is drivel. I can send you the link for Morgan Stanley's report on who owns what of the private debt. Household debt is 100% of GDP. Financial debt is 600%. So we weren't living beyond our means. No. They were. So, you know.
But it was just easier.
Rather tired.
Easier to blame us, unfortunately.
This young lady?
Yes. You were talking about the fact that solving this fraud issue, the solution would be increasing regulatory capacity. Would you, a gentleman over there was also talking about this triangular relation between the Treasury and the Bank of England and commercial banks. So to what extent would you support nationalising the regulatory capacities or transferring them into the private sector, although we have already seen that they have failed?
As you can hear, I have a inbuilt reluctance to see too much resort to nationalisation. However, I fear that there could well come a time when that may have to be certainly part of the answer. But I would say this, I would say that you don't have to, actually, believe it or not, you don't have to go very far to engineer a change in culture in ordinary people. And I think it's one of those things is that we have to hope that the new regulators are going to start engaging in re-engineering a cultural change of attitudes whereby the people who work for them do not manifest this laissez-faire attitude, this hands-off, this light-touch approach that we will develop. And I can only say this, I made Phil laugh this afternoon. When I joined the fraud squad, there was a group of us who were taken on to the fraud squad. And one of the things we started doing, we were a new breed, there's no doubt. We were not the old breed. We weren't the old corrupt old detectives. We were a new breed of young detectives. And we genuinely were incorruptible. I mean, we were there was a kind of a cadre a camaraderie of men and women who made an ethic of saying, we are going to take these people down. They're not going to get at us. And what was interesting is we started treating these elitist people. We completely ignored their elitist attitudes. We started kicking their doors in at 5 o'clock in the morning. You know, some bank manager, can you imagine Bob Diamond having his door kicked in at 5 o'clock in the morning? You know, get in the car, mate, you're nicked. And that's how we treated them. What we did was we deliberately went out of our way to cut through all these elitist rules, all these elitist attitudes they had about themselves, and these platforms on which they stood, and we took those platforms away, and we treated them exactly the same way as we treated burglars and robbers in working class communities, or criminal class communities. And
We've been treating some journalists recently.
Yes, and I tell you what,
They don't like it.
it had the most. It was so bad that eventually we were hauled off.
Of course.
Because they started complaining, and the Department of Trade and Industry started getting involved. But for about 2 years, we were truly feared. So what I'm saying is, you can re-engineer attitudes to people who've got responsibilities to investigate and to enforce. What you need is, before you get that, you've got to have people. This is where we come back to at the end of the day. You've got to have people who've got the skills, who know what to do. Presently, the Financial Services Authority is full of a bunch of old pussies who haven't got the wit or the knowledge how to go up against these people. They interviewed Tracy McDermott, who's the head of the investigations division of the financial crime division of the FSA. And they interviewed her about her investigation into UBS over the LIBOR rigging affair. And it turned out she hadn't interviewed the 3 top men in the bank. She hadn't interviewed them. And she was asked, why didn't you interview them? And she came out with some nonsense. This is a very convenient phrase these days about, we go where the evidence leads. And she said the evidence didn't lead to their door. And I wish, my wife said to me, you can imagine, Mum, me screaming at the television. I don't scream at the television, do I, Ross? Me screaming at the television.
Even when it's off.
Saying, me screaming at the television, because you don't know enough, you silly bitch. You don't know how to get there. You don't know how to ask the questions. But there they all are, sort of pontificating around and coming out, we go wherever the evidence, these bollocks.
It's the same in America. They just don't want to touch these people. They're too delicate and they're worried about what the repercussions will be. It's the same in America. Watch what Elizabeth Warren was trying to do as a new senator there.
She did it brilliantly, didn't she?
Yeah, but you see, she's not getting very far because they're just too scared. They're told, I even met someone from financial services, they were told to leave these people alone.
Sadly.
Sean.
Just going back to your point about civil unrest, I'm entirely with you there. I was an official observer for the National Union of Mine Workers in 1984, and so I was at the Orgreave coking plant every day and witnessed the violence. So not quite the same thing, but bad enough, and obviously nobody wants to see that. I think it's inevitable for 2 reasons. One, because I think what we've been missing over the last few years is any kind of public opprobrium or understanding leading to a tipping point of public opprobrium, like for example, with the Millie Dowell situation that was the tipping point for the Hackney Town leading to Leveson, etc. There's not been any of that. I don't think I think it's all very confusing for people, the whole situation with banking and the media war that has been waged. Joseph Goebbels would be proud of the fantastic job that's been done by the politicians in charge of us, of actually turning people's attention away from banking towards people who claim benefits, for example.
Well, this is one of the ways in which this government, I mean, the Tories are always particularly adept, it seems to me, at turning disparate elements within society against each other. So we have you know, we have health workers being turned because they get nice pensions, which, as far as I'm concerned, they're bloody well entitled to, against the private sector, who, you know, we don't. And then what they do is they're always looking to somehow find ways of turning disparate groups of society against each other, which, of course, as you say, takes the mind away from what's really going on. It's the nice day to bury bad news day kind of thing. But you know, you were, was it Orgreave you talked about?
Yeah, Orgreave coaching plan, yeah.
That was 74.
No,
84. 84. If it's any consolation, we used to have, that was when I was at the Fraud Squad. And I remember going down when we'd had an early morning turnover and we'd nicked somebody, and I was having breakfast downstairs in the bottom basement of the nick. Huge Holborn police station, a massive police station. And it's what's known as a marshalling centre, where when policemen were being sent off as aid to other districts, they would stop at Holborn and have a breakfast. And I went downstairs, and coming, as I do, from one side of my family, from a mining community, naturally you can understand that I have a very significant degree of sympathy for the mining community. I went downstairs for my breakfast, and sitting across the table from me were half a dozen young bobbies. Oh, couldn't have been more than 20 years old. And they were being shipped up to somewhere, I don't know, somewhere, Derbyshire somewhere. And they were all in civvies. They used to travel in civvies and then get dressed up when they got up there. And they'd all got T-shirts. And it said, Arthur Scargill pays our mortgage. And I just lost it. And I said to one of these kids, I said, we'd all heard the stories about what was going on. And I said, you guys, you should be ashamed of yourselves. I said, you are running riot up there, and you think it's funny, and you're all earning overtime on overtime on overtime. I said, you forget, you're going to leave the poor old local copper who has to police those communities on his bike. When you've gone, he is going to have to renegotiate, because all policemen renegotiate their response with their community. I said, you're going to leave him in such an appalling position. Yeah, what do you know, Grandad? And all this, which is the typical stuff you got from him. So anyway, because sometimes I have a very short fuse, I suddenly reached forward and grabbed hold of his hair and smacked his face down in his beans. And I said, that's what I know. You want some?
Yeah.
And it was a god almighty row. I nearly got sacked, but it all got hushed up. It all got hushed up, as it always did. But thank you for that intervention. That's very hard to talk about.
We've not got much time left now. This gentleman here's got a question. Does anybody else? Mike, this gentleman, Morris. Okay, we have to be. Oh, sorry. So this gentleman after that gentleman. I'm sorry. My memory's not great. That gentleman there, please.
Yes.
Then this gentleman.
What kind of message do you think it sends out when our last democratically elected Prime Minister leaked number 10 for a plane to New York? $2 million a year with JP Morgan.
Indeed.
Well, I don't think it sends a. I think I share your view. I mean, to me, it's the thin end of a very shitty wedge. And I just feel that I find it so hard to believe that we have these politicians who have now got to the stage of treating this country with such disdain. It's just become a cornucopia for them to fill their boots and to enrich themselves, while leaving behind a group of people who constantly, I mean, we're all of us being constantly bamboozled. I think we're getting a little away from the point that I started out on, but I think it's relevant. I think it comes back to this issue of what we're led to believe and how our minds are turned away from the real problems. And I think that when you get into situations like that, I think that, you know, the politicians sit up there and they bamboozle us with science and they tell us well, one thing is this and the next thing, and they flip-flop around and they're like a lot of beach bloaters. And there doesn't seem to be any kind of consistency of policy. And then you get, having made a God Almighty cock-up of things, they suddenly then, that's it, bye guys, I'm off to the big money. I feel very bad about that.
This gentleman.
Just in 1997, Dr. Mahathir in Malaysia, with the 5-point plan that I took personally to him, defied the IMF, and Malaysia was the only tiger economy that didn't crash. It can happen anywhere, as the Icelanders have told. We've shown from there. So there is a way you can buck the system, as Mrs. Thatcher said you couldn't. But look at Cameron's father was a stockbroker. But more importantly, Clegg, his father is chairman of United Bank. His grandfather was Hemi van der Volbeek, head and chairman of ABN AMRO. And he's also the president of the world, what is it, the Queen heads up. So you've got these bankers placed there to make sure there is no change, and that's what we have to actually realise. They are the enemy.
Gentleman?
Yeah, I've sort of just recent experience of our court system. I mean, how would you see, this is a hypothetical question of course, I'm sure it's never going to happen, but were some of these people to be actually indicted for the crimes that you mentioned, how would you imagine that would go down in court? I mean, would they ever get proven guilty in court? I mean, my experience is that, first of all, if it was 12 people in this room that were on the jury, then yes, they would. But, you know, I think there's a real apathy within the whole of the community through the judicial system as well.
I'll tell you what I fear at the moment. I fear at the moment that if a senior banking executive were to be arrested and charged, I suspect that his barrister would, the first line of attack his barrister would adopt, and I, as a barrister myself, albeit no longer not practicing, but as a barrister myself, I could see that it could carry weight, is that one of the arguments he could well put forward is that in the present climate of anti-banking attitudes, his client couldn't get a fair trial. That's and he could easily walk.
Which leads me on to my second point, because I asked the question because I feel that would never happen anyway, and I think it comes back to your idea of civil unrest, and I really truly believe, sadly, that's where we're heading.
I think I agree with you. I'm really hoping that what I'm hoping is that there will be, even now, there will be some prosecutions sent down in America about HSBC. There are a couple of judges who have yet to sign off on these plea deals, and they don't have to. They're not obliged to accept them. And there's one judge in particular, and I think it's in Philadelphia, who's got the ump over this, and is definitely, Bill Black is, do you know Black?
Yeah.
I mean, Bill Black is an American, both regulator and prosecutor and academic lawyer, who has been pushing very hard for keeping these things in the public eye. But at the end of the day, I genuinely believe that if the message is not sent out that all people are, as there's a lovely quote, I'm sorry, I'm full of quotes, aren't I? Lord Justice Cook, spelled Coke, once is reported to have said to Charles I over the case of ship money, he said to him, "Be you ever so high, the law is above you." And I think that if we don't get a situation in this country soon where these bankers and these people who've been enjoying this privileged existence, if ordinary people aren't capable of seeing that the law is applied even-handedly, then I think we're in deep trouble.
How can we prosecute these people when we had the situation of the Chris Hume trial, Vicky Price, where the jury is asking what does beyond a reasonable doubt mean? When you talk about very complex financial issues, and you've got...
I suspect, if you don't mind, if you forgive me, I suspect in that particular case, I suspect that there was one member of the jury who, or best two, because they couldn't even get a majority verdict. So I suspect there were one or two members of that jury who were determined to throw up all kinds of spanners, because in the second trial, didn't happen.
But we've seen this in America though, where people go out for financial crimes because their defence is it's just too complicated.
That's nonsense. Please take away from this evening, from me, it's such an insult to say of juries, we won't prosecute it because the juries won't understand it. I never once had a problem, even with some of the most complicated commodity futures cases, which I specialised in, I never had one problem with a jury getting a conviction. The problem is not the juries, it's the judges. They, in so many cases, they do not understand themselves. And if they don't understand, and they then fail to direct the jury properly, and the times I've stood in court and listened to the barristers and the judge talking about the case, I'm thinking, I don't remember this job. This job's got nothing, this case has got nothing to do with the job I investigated, because they've spun it all around. And guys, we're running way over time.
Mike, if you could make it.
Yeah, quick anecdote. I watched Pointless, that silly game show. Fred Woodwing, nobody recognised him. I ask you to sort of recognise, think how many people, he could be in this room, somebody like Fred the Shed, we wouldn't know. I mean, the idea that we're hugely ready to hang a banker is so far from the everyday
reality
discussion on knocking on doors. I'm a Labour councillor, I knock on doors, but I will tell you this, what they have been saying for the last 20 years in working class areas, we do not build enough, it's all fake money. And they were right, and if you like, our class were wrong. We've based an economy that's just on magic money.
Fiat money, yeah.
That actually we don't make anything anymore. This is why I probably dispute when you say we weren't overspending. It was on fake tax. It was coming from the financial system.
But that's the trouble.
Why do you borrow money when you could create it at zero interest, debt
Absolutely.
free?
And when you run a country,
the idea that we could go back to that and not make things, I think.
But when you run a country whose only asset is financial services, and you've done, and you've abused, and you've ruined what was once a superb manufacturing economy.
Workshop of the world.
I don't know.
I was referring to the private debts actually, not the.
No, I understand what you mean.
Also a good point, you know.
This was Gordon Brown's problem.
Yeah, it was on French.
He saw the money pouring in.
Well, just one second. With Gordon Brown, he went to the cabinet in 2004, David Blunkett's diaries, saying to everybody in the cabinet, better be prepared for a major downturn at the end of 2008. This is 4 years before, because he already knew the plan that was coming, like 1929 was a game, and you've got to stop, being fooled by it.
Maurice, have you got one more point?
Yeah, I just want to ask last question actually, because myself, I think that we've got ourselves in such a mess, and I do think that most people who know what's going on are very scared to touch it. And I'm really interested, what's happened to your parliamentary papers? What's happened to that evidence? And what do you think will happen? You just think it will be hidden?
Yeah.
Nothing will happen at all. So we have to wait to see crisis after crisis going through Europe. Because that is what's going on.
Ironically, it's not just me. I've actually had 2 or 3 people ring me up or email me and contact me and said, same thing happened to me. Over different things from this commission. Yeah. And you see, what we've got there is we've got this self-appointed elite civil servants who are deciding what the committee and commission will see. And it's only when you ring up the chairman and say, by the way, did you know that suddenly it's, oh, we found your papers. Enough.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming tonight.